Welcome back to another transcriber from Reddit. Today's topic in today's video is going to focus on games denominations play, centering around the Gospel Coalition's article on When Helping Hurts, How One Book Changed Care for the Poor, written by Megan Fowler on June 28th, 2018. This article, along with the FEMA website that I'm going to link below, this article focusing on a book titled When Helping Hurts, written by Steve Corbett and Brian Fingert, focuses around how Christians are supposed to help those less fortunate than themselves. I would say poverty. However, this article brings up disaster recovery, and only later does it discuss poverty, which really goes to show Christians will do anything, except get disaster recovery training through FEMA. Side note, this video is not sponsored by FEMA. This is sponsored by a pet peeve of mine. When Christians go out of their way to demonize organizations, including government organizations, and those efforts of demonization lead to resources like this that are written by Christians for Christians. And Christians will rely on those resources to take care and tackle every single aspect of their lives. They won't even look at resources, again, like FEMA, because FEMA has been demonized by Christians. And if you think I'm kidding, here is a jumping off point for you to investigate further into the FEMA Camps conspiracy theory. This has been something that the religious right, especially when I was growing up, propagated to everyone that would listen. I'm not going to get too into detail. However, I'm going to highlight this important section from Wikipedia. Fears of FEMA declined in the early 2000s as foreign terrorists were perceived as the major threat, but the late 2000s recession and the election of Barack Obama renewed opposition among conservatives to the federal government. Obama's election also enabled the theory to reach more mainstream right-wing circles, whereas it had previously been confined to the fringes. There was a resurgence in the militia movement, and with it, a resurgence of the FEMA Camps conspiracy theory, and a corresponding boom in the, quote, prepper, end quote, economy. Reader emails published by the magazine, National Review, have also promoted the theory. Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann alluded to the theory while in office, as have other Republican Party officials, all of which linked here. And here, in one of the links Wikipedia provided, from the SPLC.org website, written by Mark Potok, January 31st, 2014, we see the article, National Review, an email blast warns of, quote, FEMA camps, end quote. And then they have it linked below, where writer by the name of Zach Beauchamp is not just running online marketing firms, but also in promoting all of his different firms, like Food for Patriots, Power for Patriots, Survival Suits for Patriots. They rant about the Federal Emergency Management Agency's, quote, dirty little secret, end quote, warn that it has snapped up, quote, 420 million survival meals, end quote, because it knows that it is the best way to control a population and suggest a terrible crisis is coming. The review urges readers to buy Food for Patriots survival products to, quote, make darn sure your family won't go hungry or get herded into a FEMA camp, end quote, end overall quote. That is the mentality that my parents had and a lot of other conservative Christians had. So I understand that this could be the mentality of the author. I don't know for certain that it is the mentality of the author, but it could very well be impacting it. However, we know more about FEMA than we did then. Just generally, FEMA has done an amazing job of putting itself out there, of putting disaster preparedness training out there, free for everyone and available online. And the more that you take their programs, the more you interact with their agency, the more that you realize it is not what fear-mongering right-wing activists say it is. In fact, so much information has gotten out about them that other organizations that I criticize, like the Wells, even they link to FEMA resources under their disaster recovery, under their section Governmental Disaster Preparedness Planning Resources. And they encourage people to take advantage of those resources. That is a good thing. Going back to the article, given that this was written in 2018, do you think that there will be any mention of FEMA in this article, especially when they reference disaster recovery? I'm going to read through the article and you see if you can spot it. I begin reading. As Pastor Ronnie Garcia surveyed his neighborhood last fall in San Juan, Puerto Rico, two realities hit him. First, recovery from Hurricane Maria's devastation would take years. Second, it would take the church. Maria was the worst natural disaster ever to hit Dominica and Puerto Rico. The Category 5 hurricane knocked out the island's entire power grid, leaving 3.4 million residents in the dark and without relief from tropical heat and humidity. Floodwaters wiped out entire communities and destroyed 80% of local agriculture. Many neighborhoods had no running water. Garcia has no disaster response training. Side note, this would be the perfect time to link to FEMA and encourage everyone to get disaster response training. Moving on, the article says, with few options, he reached for a book he read after seminary, When Helping Hurts, How to Alleviate Poverty Without Hurting the Poor and Yourself. Inset into the article here, we see Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, courtesy of Ronnie Garcia. We see multiple trees covering a road. Continuing on, the book released 9 years ago by Covenant College community development professors Brian Fickert and Steve Corbett has become the go-to resource for evangelicals thinking about short-term missions trips and economic development for the poor. Side note. Note that there aren't any words about disaster recovery. Continuing on. Quote, this book is virtually required reading for everyone in our church who is intentionally engaging the poor here and around the world, end quote, David Platt wrote in the foreword to the 2012 edition. Quote, I have never read a better book on practically serving the poor, end quote. Quote, what a fantastic book, end quote, the Summit Church senior pastor J.D. Greer wrote on his blog. Quote, I've made it required reading for all Summit pastors as it is the, quote, small b Bible, end quote, we will live by in ministering to our community, end quote, and overall quote. Pastor and TGC board chairman Kevin DeYoung called it, quote, the best book I've read on ministering to the poor, end quote, and wrote that, quote, every pastor passionate about the poor, every deacon, every missions committee, everyone interested in short-term missions, everyone fired up for the, quote, the least of these, end quote, should read this book, end quote, and overall quote. Despite these endorsements, not everybody loved the book. Critics on the right see it as too secular, in parentheses, quote, little theological support, end quote, in parentheses, while the left faults it for not spending enough time exploring issues of social justice, parentheses, quote, they do not include addressing ... power structures through political advocacy, end quote, end parentheses. Some ministries have lost donors after implementing Fickert and Corbett's strategies. Others have received pushback from short-term missionaries wanting to choose their own activities. But overall, When Helping Hurts has been enormously well received, selling more than 400,000 copies and rating 4.6 out of 5 stars on Amazon and 4.2 out of 5 on Goodreads. It spun off 3 more books, a DVD, and hundreds of courses and seminars around the country. And it's boosted the Chalmers Center, which Fickert helped establish, from a research branch of Covenant College's Economics and Community Development Department to its own entity. The amount of attention the book garnered and the thousands of follow-up hours Fickert and Corbett spent on it is ironic, because they wrote it to get the topic out of the way so they could focus elsewhere. Section: The Class Everyone Wanted. When Helping Hurts began as an overly popular economics class. In 1999, Fickert helped found Chalmers to train churches to use economic development strategies like microfinance. He named it after 19th century Scottish pastor Thomas Chalmers, who believed the local church needed to be more active in serving the poor. It functioned as part of the Economics and Community Development Department at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. But by 2008, Fickert and Corbett needed a solution for dealing with some uncommitted students, primarily adults working in ministry, taking online classes through Chalmers. The introductory class on foundational principles of community development was wildly popular, but only a fraction of the participants signed up for the follow-up classes on microfinance. Here in the article, we see a picture of Brian Fickert with a microphone in his hand, courtesy of the Chalmers Center. Continuing on, when asked, the students admitted that they had never intended to take the second course. They just wanted some key principles that they could use in the work they were already doing. Some worked in areas such as agricultural development, clean water, or affordable housing. Others wanted to help their church work directly with the poor. Side note, these students also sound like working students, so of course, their time and attention is going to be limited to what they can reasonably do. It's not the student's fault for being uncommitted. Maybe the college should think about the student aid programs it offers if they want their students to be more committed. Continuing on, quote, "We were training all these people who weren't interested in microfinance," end quote, Fickert said. So he and Corbett combined the concepts from their introductory class with material they taught at Covenant into a book. It was supposed to free Chalmers instructors to teach microfinance classes in peace. When Helping Hurts was first published in 2009, the authors hoped a few thousand readers would benefit. Instead, it began to sell quickly and steadily. By 2014, it had sold 300,000 copies. By 2017, the book had sold more than 430,000 copies in 2 editions. Quote, "We were really quite surprised that the book took off like it did," end quote, Fickert said. Quote, "It sold very rapidly, almost immediately, and it continued to climb the charts in ways that we never imagined," end quote. And here in the article, we see an image of Chalmers staff in front of the Chalmers Center. With the caption, "Chalmers staff hold a banner sent to them by one of their West African church partnerships," courtesy of the Chalmers Center. Continuing on, speaking invitations soon followed, as did the request for new ways to teach the material to churches. Leaders at some of the nation's largest churches, including Saddleback Church in California, Fairhaven Church in Ohio, and Willow Creek Community Church north of Chicago, read When Helping Hurts. Parentheses. Saddleback and Fairhaven subsequently revamped their outreach ministries. Willow Creek now teaches teams helping without hurting in short-term missions before every trip. End parentheses. The Summit Church, which sends out more International Mission Board missionaries than any other Southern Baptist congregation, requires its staff to read it. Watermark Community Church in Dallas uses it in training for international discipleship trips, relies on it when serving the poor domestically, and depends on its principles to evaluate partner ministries. In 2010, overwhelmed with the work generated by When Helping Hurts, Chalmers became a standalone nonprofit, parentheses, though Covenant is still a partner institution. All Covenant's economics and community development profs work part-time at Chalmers, and Covenant's president and vice president for academic affairs sit on Chalmers' board, end parentheses. To meet the demand for teaching When Helping Hurts in more contexts, Corbett and Fickert released When Helping Hurts, the small group experience, Helping Without Hurting in Short-Term Missions, parentheses 2014, end parentheses, and Helping Without Hurting in Church Benevolence, parentheses 2015, end parentheses. The leadership of Life Church in Oklahoma City produced the material as a documentary in the Helping Without Hurting Seminar DVD. Side note, that sounds less like a documentary and more like promotional material. Continuing on. The book has become so widespread and influential that, quote, agencies have told me that their staff on the ground internationally can tell when the team has or has not read the book by how they behave, end quote. Peter Greer, president and CEO of Hope International, told Christianity Today. Section, New Vision for Ministry. Deborah Potter saw poverty in a new way when she heard Fickert teach at an Atlanta church in 2012. As director of community outreach at Perimeter Church, Potter could not understand why a church with 6,000 attendees was so ineffective at helping people out of poverty. Fickert's teaching on the nature of poverty turned Potter into a woman on a mission. The next day, she made a spreadsheet of the ministries Perimeter partners with for community development. She categorized them as relief, rehabilitation, and development agencies. Corbett and Fickert used that language to describe help offered to the poor, temporary relief during a crisis, rehabilitation to recover from a crisis, and development to help those in chronic poverty to support themselves and to challenge systems that work against people fulfilling these callings. Quote, one of the biggest mistakes North American churches make by far is applying relief in situations in which rehabilitation or development is the appropriate intervention, end quote, Fickert and Corbett wrote. Potter began meeting with the leaders of all 15 organizations. Quote, I told them, quote, since we all desire to change lives together, what would it look like if we did more relational work and not relief work, end quote, and overall quote. Potter said, because at the root of poverty are broken relationships. Quote, poverty is the result of relationships that do not work, that are not just, that are not for life, that are not harmonious or enjoyable, end quote, wrote Corbett and Fickert, quoting Fuller Seminary professor of transformational development Bryant Myers. Quote, poverty is the absence of shalom in all its meaning, end quote. Westerners often view poverty as lacking material needs and ignore the underlying issues, they wrote. Instead, poverty is a sin-induced strain in a person's 4 key relationships, with God, creation, others, and self. While everyone experiences some relational poverty, for certain individuals, the effects of devastating relational poverty lead to material poverty. Attempting to alleviate material poverty without addressing the underlying relational strain will not only fail, but will also tempt resourced Christians to view the materially poor as lazy, Fickert and Corbett wrote. Here in the article we have another image. It says Pastors and Wives of the Christ Collaborative, courtesy of Ronnie Garcia. It didn't take long for Potter to convince her partners of that point. The 7 ministries that did not already have a relational component agreed to add one. Fickert and Corbett hear stories like this all the time. Quote, it is profoundly encouraging to see God use our book in this way, but we are keenly aware that in many ways this really isn't our book, end quote. Note that the word "our" is italicized. Fickert told TGC. Quote, rather, it is a book that captures the insights of many people who have taught and mentored us over the course of our lives, end quote. In particular, the authors point to Myers' Walking with the Poor and Darrow Miller's Discipling Nations, The Power of Truth to Transform Cultures, as key forerunners to their work. But while Fickert and Corbett build on others like Myers and Miller, the readability of When Helping Hurts brings the content to the layman's level. Quote, we are just grateful that God enabled us to synthesize the ideas of all these people into a framework that many have found helpful, end quote, Fickert said. Quote, when people tell us how the book has impacted them, we always just say, quote, praise God, end quote, end overall quote. Section, pushback. The relational approach outlined in When Helping Hurts has a cost, particularly for Christians accustomed to swooping into poor communities with toys, food, and help. Quote, the primary strategy at the core, parentheses, of relational ministry, end parentheses, is our repentance of a sense of pride and superiority, end quote, Fickert said. But that's a lot harder to do than writing a check. Ministries risk offending and sometimes losing donors by asking them to not play the heroes. Potter saw leaders of one ministry plead with a donor to buy and donate Christmas gifts that low-income parents could purchase at a deep discount. The donor balked at this request because personally distributing gifts to low-income families was his family's Christmas tradition. Side note, there's other organizations that do similar things. You got Shop with a Cop, you got the one, I can't think of it offhand, but there's a tree one where you pick a family and then you purchase items on the list to give directly to that family. And this article is making it sound like it's more Christmas to purchase the gifts, to donate so that low-income parents can buy it at a deep discount. Wouldn't the low-income parents' financial situation justify them putting that money elsewhere? Just give the damn gifts. Anyways, continuing on. The donor couldn't see how he had made the ministry about his wants rather than preserving the dignity of low-income parents, Potter said. Quote, the primary strategy at the core, parentheses, of relational ministry, in parentheses, is our repentance of a sense of pride and superiority, end quote. Again, they feature that quote here, right after the Christmas story. God, this is infuriating. Continuing on. Sherry Lanier is a short-term missions facilitator with Mission to North America, parentheses, MNA, in parentheses, and she hears the self-centered approach to service, too. She sometimes gets calls from church leaders with a preset plan for what they want to do at a short-term site. Lanier treats these calls as opportunities to educate church leaders on the reason for short-term missions, coming alongside the local church to accomplish its ministry goals. Lanier treats these calls as opportunities to educate church leaders on the reason for short-term missions, coming alongside the local church to accomplish its ministry goals. Lanier tells short-term groups that MNA serves at the pleasure of the local church. Most groups usually appreciate the new perspective and acquiesce to the requests from the short-term site, she said. Neglecting to keep the long-term ministry goals of the local leadership in view, whether domestic or foreign, can do more harm than good, end quote, Lanier said. Quote, follow the model of Jesus, who did not come to be served, but to serve, end quote. Some churches misapply the book in ways that cause them to give less, not more. Corbett and Fickert have heard of churches that read the book and then stop giving for fear that any money they give might do more harm than good. Other churches use the book as a cover for pure stinginess. Quote, when we hear stories of people using the book to do less, it is really hurtful, end quote, Corbett said. Quote, we want people to give more money, as long as going to ministries doing the right kind of stuff. Find organizations doing the right things and give them more money, end quote. Section, Christ Collaborative. Garcia's Puerto Rican community needed development and rehabilitation, but even more, it desperately needed relief, food, water, and medical supplies. He and 4 other pastors formed a ministry network team and called it Christ Collaborative, parentheses, CC, in parentheses. They identified the hardest-hit communities, created survival kits, and found local pastors to deliver them. In exchange for the supplies, CC offered the local pastors a chance to receive training in community development using When Helping Hurts as the guide. Garcia acknowledges the concepts in When Helping Hurts are messier in real life than he expected. It's hard for residents to identify their abilities when they are dying of thirst. Side note, no shit, Sherlock. Continuing on. And even when residents have their basic needs met, not every culture has categories for thinking about talents, abilities, and skills. Side note. So that's when these people swoop in with this framework created by 2 professors in white America to tell them, hey, you need to start thinking along these lines. Because our framework is the best. Continuing on. So Garcia must make on-the-fly adjustments. When one elderly couple told him they couldn't be of any use, he pointed out their thriving tomato and banana plants and asked if they'd teach others to garden. Parentheses, they did, end parentheses. Lanier has channeled financial resources to Garcia, and she looks forward to when she can send groups to assist him. But not yet. She knows that right now a group from the mainland staying in a hotel might displace Puerto Ricans who need the lodging. When Garcia is ready, Lanier will send skilled volunteers who can work alongside Puerto Rico residents to restore communities and increase shalom. Ministry leaders around the globe tell Fickert that when a visiting team has read When Helping Hurts, the group is less focused on doing things and more intent on building relationships. Their attitudes communicate, quote, "We are all broken and need Jesus to fix us," unquote. Quote, "For those who have really read and embraced When Helping Hurts, their posture to the world and the poor is different," end quote, Fickert said. Quote, "There is less triumphalism and a lot more of the gospel. There is less confidence in having all the answers and more humility to step back and learn and talk to people. We haven't changed everything, but we have seen significant changes," end quote. Section, Flourishing and Dreaming. When Fickert meets people who have been affected by the book, he always wants to hear more about their ministry. Quote, "People sometimes treat authors like celebrities or heroes, but the real heroes are those who work day in and day out on the front lines of poverty, sacrificing themselves for others without getting any recognition," end quote, he said. When Corbett hears praise for the book, he holds it loosely, knowing it's empty talk unless readers put the book's concepts into practice. Ultimately, the legacy of When Helping Hurts will rest not in how many copies it sells or how many workshops it guides, but in how many Western churches abandon the savior complex and submit to a broader, deeper understanding of human flourishing. Gospel Coalition is featured another quote. For those who have really read and embraced When Helping Hurts, their posture to the world and to the poor is different," end quote, Fickert said. Quote, "There is less triumphalism and a lot more of the gospel," end quote. Continuing on, quote, "Inch deep and mile wide," end quote, "is glamorous and easy to understand," end quote. And overall, quote, he said, "But the new model, which is smaller, longer, and harder, has deeper impact," end quote. This new view of flourishing, according to Fickert, centers on the gospel where Jesus is Lord of the physical and spiritual realms and is reconciling everything in heaven and on earth to himself by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. That view ties history to the future, locating help itself in the story of a redemption already paid and the hope of a final redemption to come. One sign of hopeful helping and a community flourishing is its ability to dream, Garcia said. If a community can dream for itself, he counts that a win. And if the same communities receiving relief after Maria are so strong that they offer relief to other communities after the next hurricane, that's a win too. Here ends the article. If you hazarded a guess that FEMA was not going to be mentioned anywhere in this article, you would be correct. Because why focus on getting more training through a government agency when you can just rely on purchasing a book from a couple of authors to help you figure out how to navigate disasters? Christians really will do anything except take FEMA training. It's not that I disagree with everything that's being said here. However, navigating a disaster by going through FEMA training will give you better tools to save lives, to help other first responders, to organize everybody so that when you get into the aftermath of disaster recovery, you can be better set up for success. This article needed also a better transition from the sentence, "It's hard for residents to identify their abilities when they are dying of thirst." Yeah, it is hard for people to identify their abilities when they are dying of needs that money could provide. And this article doesn't even transition into a different idea or sentence of, well, yes, the authors do expect you to immediately take care of physical needs like dying of thirst, dying of hunger, etc. There's not even that disclaimer in this article. This is just hyping up this idea of setting up relationships with each other and with communities, which isn't a bad thing. Like this idea of having this elderly couple who apparently understands gardening, asking them to teach others to garden. That is a great idea for food sustainability. However, should that be the immediate steps you take right after a disaster? I would argue no. And this article also doesn't present any sort of timeline that us as the readers can look at and say, okay, they were able to address immediate needs first, the dying of hunger, dying of thirst, etc. And then they go into this relational aspect. This article combines everything together, which results in this looking as just a puff piece, a promotional piece for a book. And again, they don't mention or encourage people to go out and get FEMA training, which is free compared to the cost of this book. Speaking of FEMA trainings, let's go over to their website here. Here we have sign up for trainings. And when you click on it, here is their National Preparedness Course Catalog. I know I'm on mobile and it looks horrendous. I apologize for that. But here is a sampling of the classes that they provide. And you click on one, and it tells you how many hours to expect it to take and what it covers. If there's any prerequisites. Here, moving over to another course, which takes you over to the independent study site. And this one, in particular, I recommend everyone take, so you understand how disaster recovery instant command systems should work. Which, by the way, is incredibly important for any time you need to contact anybody whenever there's a crisis going on. It tells you, again, course length, how to take the course, and take final exam. No cost, completely free. Don't be like the author of this article and only recommend a roughly $20 to $30 book. Take a free course from FEMA instead. And then check the book out from the library before you commit to buying it. Thank you for watching/listening, and I will see you in the next video.